Welcome to this video. I'm Ingo from Roast Rebels, and in this video we will have a look at the Kaffelogic Studio software. This video is intended for people that newly own a Kaffelogic Nano 7 roasters and that want to get an understanding on the software. But of course, if you're just interested in the machine and want to know what would expect you, then it may also make sense to have a look into the video to get an understanding of the software that comes with the machine. This video is a part of a series of 3 videos. In the first video we had a look at the machine in general, how it's working. In the second video we did a roast together on the Kaffelogic Nano 7, and in this video we will deep dive into the software. What I can recommend you in any case is to follow our channel, so better do it now so that you don't miss anything, because we will regularly post videos on the machines but also on other topics when it comes to roasting. So now let's start, and in order to show you the software we will switch to the computer. First of all, you need the software on your computer, and therefore you can just go on the Kaffelogic website, and here you find support, and on support you find downloads. And if you click on downloads, you can see here the Kaffelogic Studio software, and then you can either download it for a Mac, for a Windows PC or for Linux. Usually your version is already highlighted, so you could click on this and then the software is very simply installed on your computer. Once you have done that, you can start the Kaffelogic Studio software. On my computer it's of course already installed, and when you open it you will get like a tip of the day. At least the first time you're in the software you can have a look at these tips. You can check the different tips they are giving. They are very useful for the use of the Kaffelogic Studio. So you can close that if you don't want to have it. The next time you can take away this tick here. So just close this window, and now you're in the Kaffelogic Studio software. I will lead you through the menus, and after that we will have a look at 3 different kinds of situation where you're going to use the Kaffelogic Studio software. One is what I would call the machine management, where you're kind of checking if your machine is up to date. The second one is designing profiles. This is probably the one you are looking forward to most, because you're designing the roast profiles for your machine. And the third one is then having a look at the logs of your machine, so the saved roasts. When we go through the menu, we can see here file. You knew that from other softwares. You can open a new file. You can actually then design a new roasting profile from the scratch. But I would in any case recommend you, when you're working on roast profiles, take one that's existing and then do some changes there. You will probably see then in this video that there are a lot of settings behind the roast profile. So it's the easiest to take another one and then change it from there, but you could also start with a new file. You can open a file. Here in recent files you see the last files I've been working with. You could choose one of these. Save as, you can save a profile or a log. With properties you will see the profile for which firmware it is. So there could be a situation if the firmware on your computer is very old that it's not fitting with the profile. But anyway, I recommend you to always keep the firmware up to date. Here you can import and export to other softwares like Artisan, Cropster and so on. With new app window you can open a new Kaffelogic window, and then with quit of course you can close the software. In edit you have the undo and redo functions, so when you do changes on the roasting profile you could just easily undo it with this flash, with this button, or with Ctrl and Z. Draw, this is something we will have a look at when we then be working on roasting profiles. In the view you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can expand the y-axis, you can go back here. If you click on zoom all, then you will have the screen where you can perfectly see the whole roasting profile. Tools, view memory stick is something we will have a look at in a second. Then compare default, compare files, transform profile, merge profiles is something we will have a look in the part where we'll be talking about profiles. The area under the curve is a mathematical function to measure the area under a curve from a certain point to another one. In the time calculator, you have some calculator functions here. And capture and save image, you can then capture an image of what you see on your screen, for example, this profile, and then save it, and it will be saved as a PNG file, so that you can easily share it with other people and have a look at the profile with other people. Explore memory stick backups. These are the backups that you have saved on your memory stick. And then in the options difficulty, this is a nice feature of Kaffelogic, and maybe that's a point to talk about the philosophy of Kaffelogic. So they are willing and very open to just open everything for you in the machine, so that you can actually change all the settings you want in very detail. In fact, for most of us, this is not really relevant, and most of us will even be overwhelmed by all the settings that Kaffelogic is offering, and therefore they do the profiling in different difficulties. So most of us that are just normal users, they will be happy with the basic functions or advanced functions. I will show you then these functions later when we talk about the profiles. But if you would like to, you can go into engineer mode, where you have the possibility to change more or less everything on your machine and in your roast. But that said, I really recommend you all do the machine, and Kaffelogic is giving you the opportunities to change everything. Be a bit careful here, because you could be a bit overwhelmed and then go into details where you're changing things in details just because you can, and you will probably be at the place where you're working on details that you don't really taste in the coffee. So first of all, when you want to have a nice tasting coffee, you need to choose the right beans. Then you need to choose the right color. And that's actually the main decisions that you have to take when you want a good coffee. After that, you can think about the steepness or the speed of the roast, especially when it comes to the development time. And if you can manage this, then you more or less manage everything you need to when it comes to creating a good coffee, and everything that you can change here, especially then when it comes to engineer mode, are things that then are really small details on the machine. So these options, you can choose, for example, the position of your USB save button. Is it the bottom right corner like here, or in tabs? Where is the position of your phases panel? We will talk about phases later. What are the name of the phases? So what they recommend you here, or what's already in the software, are the classic names like drying, Maillard, development. Then default temperatures you can already set. So color change is one factor we sometimes talk about in roasting. So in roasting, if you have a look, for example, at the book that Rob Hoos was writing, he was talking about drying phase, and then between drying phase and Maillard phase there is the yellowing point, and then after the Maillard phase there is the first crack, and then after first crack is the development phase. So this is kind of a classic way, but in fact, especially this yellow point, so drying phase to Maillard phase, is really a bit hard to distinguish, and it's not such a very clear point to define. Therefore, I and also many other roasters don't really work with this color change point. But what's really important when you're talking about roasting is the first crack, and first crack is also a point that you will recognize very nicely. So first crack is when the beans are cracking, and especially when they start to regularly crack. So not the first ones, but when they start to regularly crack, at that point you mark the first crack, and then you have a division of your roast time into the time up to first crack and then the time from first crack to the end. And the time from first crack to the end is called the development time, and then you can divide this development time by the total time of your roasts, which then will be called development time ratio in percentage. And this is something we will have a look at when we're talking about profiles and logs again. just for you to know, in the settings you could define a default temperature. You don't need to do that. You can then also set it in a particular profile. Line width, so how wide your lines will be. ROR, y-axis multiplier. I don't really know what this one is, to be honest. ROR is the rate of rise. ROR, smoothing of logs. So this is the smoothing of the ROR. And then show second derivative with the rate of rise. Legend font size, you can change the legend font size, show the tips at the startups that you've seen at the beginning. You can tick that away or leave it. Zoom on mouse wheel and scroll gesture, so you can zoom here by turning the wheel on the mouse, and automatically check for updates. Then here we have the compare options. If you are comparing files, then you can display some different factors. And what's this, like mean temperature profile, ROR is always ROR is always the rate of rise. So we will be talking about this when we will have a look at the logs. Then in the help tab, there are tips, documentation, community forum, support, and about. Now we will go into the first situation that we work with the Kaffelogic Studio software. And this is what I would call the machine management. So you can click either on this USB stick, or you've seen before view memory stick. This is the same thing that will happen. So if you click on this, we'll come to this window that is popping up. And if you've seen my 3 videos on the Kaffelogic, the first one, which was the kind of the quick start guide, we already had a look at this window here. So here you have 4 tabs. The first tab are the logs. A log is a saved file from a roast. So when you did a roast and you had your USB stick in the machine during that roast, then it will be saved as a log. You see each log has a number. So for example, in the last video where we did a roast on the Kaffelogic Nano, we were recording this log here, log number 51. We had the profile 1500 to 2000 meter rest when we roasted the Kenyan coffee. We used the profile like this profile, and the creator has been Kaffelogic. So Wayne Burrows created that profile for us. Here we see when the profile has been created. And then here we can see the level that we choose. So we roasted to level 2.9. The whole roast took us 9 minutes. And we can add some notes here. This is something we will have a look at later in this video. Second thing are the profiles. Here I would see all the profiles that I have on my USB stick. The ones I currently have on this USB stick are the core profiles that Kaffelogic provided. But if I would have profiles that I had designed on my own, or if I had profiles that I got from a coffee group, from a Kaffelogic group, or coffee board, or from a friend, then this would be shown here as well. In the next tab, there are the core profiles. So the core profiles are the profiles that have been developed by the Kaffelogic team and that are on their website. So here you see a comparison of what's on the Kaffelogic website and what's on your USB stick. And then you can compare. So in my case, you see I have all the profiles that are on the website already on my USB stick. This is the usual case when you receive your machine. And I can also see when I look at the profiles, this is version 1.1, this is version 1.1, so I also have the most actual versions of each profile. If this wouldn't be the case, I could click here on this link and then update the profiles. Here is the firmware. So the firmware is kind of the software that's within your roaster to control your roaster. And from time to time there are updates here. Then you can see the latest available firmware is, for example, 7.5.0.1124. And if I check here, I see the firmware update on my USB stick is the latest. So I already have the latest software on my USB stick. If this wouldn't be the case, there would be a blue link and I could just click on the link and there would be then the newest firmware on my USB stick. If this is the case and I need to update the firmware on my roaster, I can see here what I need to do. So I would need to take the USB stick out of the computer and put it in the roaster. Then I would need to hold the roaster's start button while I'm turning on the roaster, and then the firmware will be updated. If I want to check if I have the most actual software firmware on my roaster, I can go into the menu. In the first video, in the quick start video, I will show you how the menu is working. So I press the menu button until I see the option for technical info. Then I can use the play button until I see the firmware version, then I can compare it. To get you an understanding on how this is going to look like on your USB stick. So you have your USB stick. On the USB stick you have 4 folders. One is for the firmware, where I have the firmware saved on the USB stick. The other are manuals. You can have a look at this manual folder actually on your USB stick, because there's some interesting information here, like the instruction booklet as a PDF. There is a map of coffee growing countries in the world, where I get an idea on at which altitude usually the coffee is being grown in which country. This is just helping me to choose the right profile. I have a core profile guide, which is going to help me to choose the right profile. And then here I have the Kaffelogic Roasters Companion, and this is a document where you get some information about coffee roasting, where you get some information about the Kaffelogic machine, but also about Kaffelogic Studio. So I can recommend you to have a look at this document and read it as well. Roast logs. If I having a look at the roast logs, I see that's what we've seen before in Kaffelogic Studio also, and these are just like common files. The roast logs as well as the profiles. You see these are just normal files, and that's the nice thing about the Kaffelogic roaster, that you can just then exchange files with anybody. So you can just take a file here as you're used in Windows or Mac or Linux, and then you can send it by email or upload it to a coffee board or upload it to a coffee group, and then just you can very easily exchange profiles and logs with other people. Now back to the Studio software, we will go into the second part of this video. Now we are having a look at the second situation, which is the roast profiling. First of all, in order not to confuse you, I untick all those boxes. And what you can see here now is the most important thing, which is your roast profile. You see a roast profile is always a temperature curve. So you can see here the temperature, which is relating to the bean probe sensor in your machine in degrees Celsius. And then here you see the timing axis, so time in minutes and seconds. And what the roast profile in fact is just a function of the temperature per time. So for example, if I look here at 1 minute 26, the temperature should be at 136.6 degrees Celsius. At 2 minutes 19, it should be around 170 degrees, and so on. And to get you an understanding on how the Kaffelogic roaster is working, it's a so-called PID controlled roast. So the machine is automatically following this temperature curve. This is something, if you have a drum roaster, if you're a production roaster and you have tried PID controlled roasting, you might be struggling a bit, because there are just that much of thermodynamics going on in a drum roaster and that much of settings that it's really hard to do. But in a small roaster like the Kaffelogic is, where you just have this very small roasting chamber and not a lot of influence factors, just actually the stream of hot air, you will really be able to let the machine control the roast that way, that it's automatically going to follow this temperature curve. So therefore, the way it works, you design a profile, then you take this profile, load it to your machine, and the machine is following this profile curve. Now let's have a look at all the different settings that are possible here. So the first thing is time and temperature. If I click on one of these blue points Here in the bottom you see the position of the different points. So if I click, for example, on this point here, I see this is at minute 2 and at 160.8 degrees Celsius. If I click on this point, it's at 182.1 and 2 minutes. Unfortunately, the seconds here are a bit hard to be seen. So this one here are always the points. And here I see a little bit of a difference, because if I'm clicking slightly not perfectly on the dot, then I always just see the figures of the point where I'm holding my mouse. And this one here below is then the temperature and the time really of this dot. And when we are going to into profiling, we will be able to see that this is not only an indication of this temperature and time, I could also change it here on a very fine grade. But we will have a look at this later. Next thing we have here is the rate of rise curve. The rate of rise is the derivation of the temperature curve. So it actually means, and it's also measured in temperature per minute. So for example, this indication of 61.8 as a rate of rise at this timing point means that at this point of the roast, the temperature would increase by 61.8 Celsius per minute. And this is calculated regularly by the machine. Therefore, you can see it really for each single point of your curve. And what this is going to give you as an indication is kind of the momentum of your roast, or the speed of your roast. So you see, the higher the rate of rise, the higher the temperature increase. And then the lower the temperature increase is, so you see here the curve is going to flatten, the lower the rate of rise is. The next thing that you can click here is the fan curve, but we will have a look at the fan curve when we go into this tab. That's about the fan curve. But just for you to know, when you have a look at the profile, you can also switch on the fan curve so that you have everything in one display. Then you have so-called zones. We're going to talk about zones later. This is a possibility to slightly change the roasting profile at the particular point, but as I told you, we will have a look at this in a couple of minutes. Phases, I told you before, this is then the division of the roast by the phases that you defined. So we've been talking about the drying, the Maillard, and the development phase. And if you do an expected color change for the yellowing point, you would see then the phases for yellowing. You would see then the phases for drying and Maillard. What you can do is define an expected point where first crack will appear. So I just don't take this number as given. I just take an example. For example, I expect first crack to be happening here at 208.8 degrees Celsius. Then I could choose 208.8 here. Then I would see the development phase would be if I'm roasting up to this level here, which is kind of the recommended level, but it's not mandatory to roast to that point, it's just the recommended level. Then I would get a roast development time percentage of 33.3 degrees. I have been talking about these values in the roasting with the Kaffelogic video. And you also saw where we were marking the first crack, we got a yellow line here. So this yellow line is indicating at which time we are going to expect first crack, if we are expecting it at this temperature of 208.8 degrees Celsius. Of course, I can only mark this when I've done some roast and I know from experience around where the first crack is going to happen. Otherwise, if I don't know where the first crack is going to happen, of course, I don't mark anything here. Then next thing is a grid. This is just giving you a little bit more indication on the temperature and timing. So it's a grid that is dividing by minutes and by 50 degrees Celsius. But you saw here appearing as well is the so-called threshold line. So the logic behind the profiles in Kaffelogic is that you're going to roast to a particular roast level. And this is actually a smart thing about the roaster, because the roast level, which you could also explain by the color of your roast, is the factor that has most influence on the taste of your coffee when it comes to roasting a coffee. Therefore, Kaffelogic is really taking emphasis on this roast level. And what they are defining for each profile is a recommended level. So here for this profile, for example, the recommended level is 3.3, but you don't have to roast to that level. You can roast to a higher level, for example, to 4 or 5, or to a lower level for 1. And then you would just see the roast would stop somewhere here. So for example, if I want to see where the roast would stop, if I would choose roast level 4.5, for example, then I see the roast would stop somewhere here at around 233 degrees Celsius at around 10 minutes 45. There is a threshold line which has a particular steepness in it, and the idea behind this is that actually the way your coffee is developing is a function of time and temperature. So either you can put more time in the roast, or you can put more temperature in the roast. So you could have a longer roast with a bit less temperature, or you could have a shorter roast with a bit more time. You would get to about the same roast level. This is something that is being indicated by this threshold line. And as you will see later in the engineering mode, you will be able to change the steepness of this curve. Then we go back here to 3.3. Next thing I can see here is a legend, and the legend is then explaining me what I can see on this profile. So I can see the green line, which is the rate of rise. I can see the blue line, which is the profile. I can see the yellow line, which is the expected first crack. I can see the red line, which is the so-called threshold line. I can see these blue points. I can also see this red dot, which is the recommended level. If you have a look at the fan profile curve, this is then being shown in rotations per minute of the machine by the time function. So you see, for example, here at 1 minute 01, I have 40,700 rotations per minute in the fan. Here at 9 minutes 01, I have 30,200 rotations per minute. So the main function of the fan is for your beans to be moved regularly, so that they're turning, spinning nicely in the roasting chamber, and then that they are very evenly in contact with the hot air, so that they are going to roast evenly. I would at the beginning not recommend you to work on the fan profile curve, just take it as it is. But if you want to work on the fan profile curve, I would recommend you to, in the first place, check with your machine what would be the minimum and the maximum speed of your fan that you can use. And to do that, you can go into this timer mode of your roaster. You will find it in the manual. So have a look at the manual, how to get into the timer mode. The timer mode is a mode where you start your roaster and you can manually decide with how many rotations per minute the fan is working and with how many watts the heating element is working. So you will go into the timer mode. You would leave the heating element at 0, so you wouldn't put any heat into the roast. You would just work with the fan, and then you would put in the amount of beans that you are going to roast, and then you can see when the coffee beans are regularly spinning in the roaster, then this is the minimum fan rotations per minute that you're going to choose, and the point where then the coffees are being thrown out of the roast chamber is the maximum that you can choose. So you have to be somewhere between these, and then you know in which area you can work with when it comes to the rotations per minute. So yeah, if you're interested in doing some experiments with your roaster and work on the fan profile curve, then you can do it here, and we will just in a couple of minutes have a look at on how you can really then change the fan profile curve. Here you can also add a grid. Here you can also add a legend. Here you can also see for the different points then the speed at this point, and then you can either change the speed at this point here or grab the little dot, but I will show you, as I told you, when we are working on the profiles. About this file, I can give here each profile a short name. I can tell here who has been the designer of the profile. So you saw for the core profiles that have been designed by Wayne Burroughs, it was written Kaffelogic. And he also added a lot of information on each profile in the description. You can do that, of course, as well if you want to. And then profile settings, this is something we will deep dive later into as well. But now let's go into the roast profile curve and see how we can change a roast profile curve. If you're changing a roast profile curve, you can just grab one of these points and you can then just steer it up or down however you want. So that way you can very easily change the curve. I can make it, for example, a bit steeper here, make a bit steeper roasting curve by just dragging these points. If I want to work a little bit more fine graded, you see I can change it here, and these are then really small changes that are going to happen here on the curve. And you can also see how the expected first crack line is moving depending on your depending on the steepness of your curve. So let's say I go up here with this curve. What I can also do here is then change the steepness of your curve by grabbing these little yellow points. So I can make some quite crazy curves if I want to here, going up and down. Here I always see in live calculated the rate of rise of your curve. What I could do here is add more points, and this is in the draw function. I could insert a point. If I press on insert a point, I see there is a point insert in the midway between the point that I marked and the next one. So I'm marking this point, say insert point, and in the midway between this and the next one there is a new point created. If I click on one point, I can then also delete it. If I have a bit too many points, then I can delete this point. I can smooth the curve at the particular point by clicking on smooth point. I can also smooth the whole curve by clicking on smooth all, and then you've probably seen, if you had a look at also the rate of rise curve or the roast profile curve, it's just a bit nicely being smoothed by clicking on smooth all. The smoothing function is something I can recommend in any case if you have been working on a profile, just in order to get a bit more even and a bit more smoothened out curve. Now that I did some changes on the roasting profile, I can go on tools and I could, for example, compare it with the default. So that was the curve that was before I edited it. I can see how it looked like before, how it looks like now. I can take this away again. I can also compare it when I go and compare profiles. I need to choose a roast profile. So I take, for example, the one that we used for the Kenyan coffee. Then I can see this roast profile was designed like this one. The one that I did now is much more steeper, especially at the beginning. I can clear compare. I can also transform the profile. So if I go on transform profile, I can put a factor behind, for example, let's say the time axis. Then the whole time axis is being prolonged. I can put a factor on the temperature axis. I redo that. I can then also probably just add some minutes, and like this the whole profile is being transformed. I could also merge the profile, and in order to show you that, I do, for example, a fan profile curve now as well. If you have a look at the fan profile curve, the editing of the profile is about the same as with the temperature profile. I could, for example, add another point here and then change the curve for this particular point. Now I have another fan profile curve. I can show the fan profile here also on the temperature curve. And if I say now, I actually had a very nice fan profile curve, for example, in another roast, I could then merge this profile with another profile. I take, for example, the cupping profile. And if I merge this profile with another one, I can choose which factor I want to merge. Do I want to take the roast profile curve, the expected color changes, the short names, the zones, all other profile settings? And now I say, for example, I want to take the profile, fan profile curve from the other profile. If I click on merge, then I see it has taken the fan profile curve from the cupping profile and left the temperature curve that I created. So like that, I can merge two different profiles and choose which factor I want to merge into the other profile. So that said, I hope you understand on how to change the roast profile curve, how to change the fan profile curve. And now I have also some profile settings that I can work with. And the profile settings that I get here are correlated by the difficulty that I choose. So I have 4 difficulties: the basic, advanced, expert, engineer. And I see, for example, with the basic difficulty, I have 2 factors that I can influence. If I would go into engineer, I would have really a long list of factors that I can influence in this roast. And now we'll start with the basic function. If I'm flying over these texts with my mouse, then a window will appear which is telling me what actually this factor is. For example, the preheat power. I can see here the text about the preheat power, what the preheat power is. And what the Kaffelogic team also provided is always a default value. So for example, if I change something here, and now I don't know why I changed it, I would like to go back to the default, then I can just fly over the text. I see default is 1050 watts, and I can go back to 1050 watts. This is the same for all these different settings that you will see then. So let's have a look at the ones that are provided with in the basic option. And as you can imagine, these are the most important ones. And then the more you deep dive into the difficulty, the more detailed you will be. So preheat power, this is the power with which your heating element is working in the first phase of the roast. And maybe also to get an understanding what the preheating is in the Kaffelogic Nano. If you're, for example, used, or if you have heard about preheating a roast on a drum roaster, we have a completely different thermodynamics. So in a big drum roaster, you have a lot of steel, you have a lot of mass that needs to be preheated, and before you do the first roast, because then this steel, the metal of your roasting chamber, will transform the heat to your beans. In the Kaffelogic Nano, I just have a really small roast chamber, and I don't have a lot of material. I have this tiny metal part of the roast chamber, which is then hot within a partial of a second. I have the hot air stream, which is changing its temperature very quickly. So therefore, I don't really need a preheat phase when I'm roasting with the Kaffelogic Nano. And this is also, if you're a bit into roasting curves, into roasting profiles, you will probably know that when you have a roast profile curve on a drum roaster, you see it would start somewhere here around 250, because this was the preheat temperature of the empty roaster. And then once you throw in the beans, the temperature is breaking down to somewhere around 100 degrees Celsius, and then there is a turning point and the temperature curve is starting again. With the Kaffelogic, I don't have that, because I don't preheat the whole machine. I really start at the point where I'm putting in the bean, for example, around 20 degrees Celsius, or where your room temperature or bean temperature is. And then as soon as I apply heat or power to the roast, the curve is starting. And in this setting, I can define the power that I'm giving into the roast at the beginning stage of the roast. This is something that I can influence a bit depending on the size of your beans. Some people also say depending on the density of your beans. You can just use it if you get some information about the roast where the preheat temperature would be higher. You also set a higher value here. If you get some information about the roast that the preheat temperature should be lower, you also choose a bit a lower temperature setting here. Then the minimum desired rate of rise. So to explain you saw the temperature increase here, you saw the rate of rise curve here, and as I told you, the machine will more or less precisely follow this profile curve. But during the roast, there are some thermodynamics that can happen. For example, a coffee bean is going into an exothermic stage where suddenly it's getting hotter than the machine expected to, just because of the way the coffee beans are working. So for example, if the roasting curve would increase here dramatically, then what the roaster would normally do is take away the power in order to let the temperature fall to the curve again, and then start with putting in energy again. If it would do that, then it can happen that you have a temperature drop here. And these temperature drops, they can lead to stale coffee, they can lead to baking or just an unpleasant taste in your coffee. Therefore, you want to avoid situations like this. And what you can do then is setting a minimum rate of rise. This means the roaster cannot just drop the temperature down, because then I would have a negative rate of rise, but it can just slow down the roast so that it's being lowered as slow as possible until it's meeting the curve again. When you're going to set a minimum desired rate of rise, you have to take care that firstly you will have a look at the rate of rise curve, and then you look which is the lowest point of the rate of rise. So for example, I see here I have a rate of rise of 3.9. In the profile that I designed, even 3.8. Therefore, my minimum rate of rise must not be higher than the lowest rate of rise that I get into my profile. Because if it would be higher, then the machine wouldn't allow itself to go down to this line here. It will always be a bit higher and always will put more energy into the system. I hope somehow you understand the logic behind this. So if you're setting here a value, this is just the minimum that you allow the machine to get when it comes to rate of rise. Therefore, it has to be lower than the minimum that you define for your profile. So it has to be lower than 3.8 in this case. So you could go, for example, to 3.5, just a value that is lower than the minimum that you created in your profile. So these are the two settings that I can do in the basic mode. Then if I go to the advanced mode, I see some additional things. And one is, for example, this zone boost function, which is also explained in the Kaffelogic Nano roasting companion document. I took, for example, a roasting log that I found from somebody in a coffee group, and you see here blue was the profile that he designed, and then red was then actually the curve that was following this profile. And you see here at this point the curve was faster than the profile log. This is most probably since the coffee beans have been turning into an exothermic stage. The coffee beans have been heating up themselves faster than they were supposed to in the profile. If I come to a situation like this, I will see, when I see the rate of rise, so the blue line is the rate of rise that he had in his roast, I see that the rate of rise dropped here quite low. I could have avoided that by setting a minimum rate of rise setting, but in order to completely avoid this happening here, I could now define a zone for the next roast. So for example, I say at 8 minutes 30, then my zone will start. At 9 minutes 30, this zone will end. So I defined a timing of the zone, 8 minutes 30 to 9 minutes 30, and then I defined a boost value, which in this case would be negative, in order to bring down the curve a bit, to bring down the temperature a bit closer to the curve. So I could, for example, say I have a zone that is starting at 8 minutes 30, it's ending at 9 minutes 30, and then I do a negative boost of, for example, 2. You then really have to play around with these values to a roast and then compare the log again in order to get closer and closer to the curve. Usually there are values of -5 up to +5 that you can choose here in the boosting option, and yeah, just give it a try to the next roast and then look if the curve is better following the profile. One other thing, smart thing, is the corners. And you don't see a corner happening in this roast, but for example, if he would have roasted darker, let's say if we would have roasted until about 14 minutes, then you see here there is a corner. And the roast would have been following this curve here a bit longer, and then it would have realized that there was a corner and then getting back to the roast profile curve. In order to avoid this, you could tell your machine, hey, there is a corner happening here. You can say the corner is starting at 12 minutes 30 and is happening until about, let's say, 13 minutes 15. So I could add these values here. Take care, little roaster, there is a curve happening between minutes 12:30 and between minutes 13:15. And then the machine itself would be smart enough to calculate or to know that there will be a curve happening here, and it would be careful enough to then follow the profile curve here. So these are the settings that you might use when you get a bit deeper into roasting. And if you want to, you can even add more factors in the export mode. One thing, for example, that you get here is the roast end time ratio, which is this threshold line. So you see the threshold line is defined here by 0.333, which creates then a threshold line with this steepness. If I would here go into the extremes and choose, for example, 1 as a value, then I would see it's a vertical line here. So then the roast level of 3.3, for example, would always be at the same time. So then the roast would always stop at the same time. If I, for example, then do it as a 0, then I would get a horizontal line. This would then mean the roasting is always ending at the same temperature, depending on the time that has been gone into the roast. This is something you can play around with, and then there are a lot of other factors, even more so if you go into the engineering mode. But yeah, be careful, this can really overwhelm you. But yeah, if you're a nerd, then you can, of course, then deep dive into this one here. You see settings for the PID, for example, that you can change, for the preheating. So there is really mostly everything that's going to happen during the roast in your machine can be changed here. So if I have this profile and I could then save it, and as I see here, we've been talking about the minimum rate of rise functioning, and I see here roast minimum rate of rise is set at 3.5 per minute. The recommended setting for this profile curve is 2.8. So the Kaffelogic team is nice enough to give me some recommendations here as well. So I will follow their recommendation and then go back into the basic settings, choose here the value of 2.8. Then I go back to my profile, I save it, and now let's say I say this is called roasting profile tutorial. If I would go on my stick again, I would see here on the profiles that I have this tutorial now on the stick as well, this profile. And if I would now put my USB stick into the roaster, I would have this profile on my roaster and could follow this profile. Now we will have a look at the third situation that you will have with your Kaffelogic Studio software, and this is the view of logs. So if I take, for example, the roasting that we did in the other videos, I can choose this log. Then I can see here that I have more or less the same tabs. There is one tab more than in the profiles, which is called the log. There will be also then the profile curve, where I see the profile I've been working with, the fan profile curve I've been working with in this roast, about this file, so I can see the settings that have been used in this roast. So for example, this roasting profile here, 1500 to 2000 meters rest have been used. I roasted to level 2.9, so I cannot change this value. I can just have a look at it. First crack appeared at 6 minutes 29 seconds at 211 degrees Celsius. What I can add here are tasting notes. So I can say, for example, it's a very fruity, pleasant, sweet taste. For example, then I could add this here. I could go into the profile settings. Also here I have again the possibility to show all of them depending on the difficulty that I choose, but also I cannot change them. I can really only have a look at it because it's a log. Then if I'm going to have a look at this log curve, what I can do here is also add a grid. I can also add a legend. Let me take this away so to give you a bit a clear view. Now you see I have here an indication of the zone boost. So I saw here I had a boost in this zone of +3. Then I see here the mean temperature. So there are different temperature readings that I can get out of the sensor. I recommend you to just work with the mean temperature and always then use the same settings, but the profiles are designed for this mean temperature. And I see blue here the profile curve. I see green here the rate of rise that would have happened in the profile. I see here the actual rate of rise that happened during my roast in the blue line, in the brown line. And then I see the power of the heating element. So I see, so it was working a bit hotter in the beginning, then it cooled a bit down, and then it was building up again, and was putting more energy into the roast. And here, when it came to cooling, the heating element was have been switched off. And then I see here the green point was the first crack where it was happening. If I add the phases, then I would see here the logged first crack that I did in the roast at 211 degrees Celsius. And I see I had a roast environment time percentage, for example, of 27.9. The roast log, the end was at 221 degrees Celsius at around 9 minutes. No, at exactly 9 minutes. Then check boxes is something that I've talked with you also about when we were talking about the comparing options. So this is just different values that can be displayed here. Spot temperature and temperature are different temperature readings of your thermocouple, but as I said, I would take the mean temperature here. Then the profile is the profile that have been designed, so I can show it or unshow it. I can show the profile rate of rise, the actual rate of rise that happened during the roast. I can display a desired rate of rise, although I have to be honest, I don't know what this is. Then here I have the power of the heating element. I have the volts that were happening in your roast. This is, for example, interesting for you if you have any issues with the machines and you're talking about it with the service team. You will have a look at the volts curve. These are factors for the PID that you can show or unshow here, the fan speed, and then also the zones that you could show or take away in this view. Then here I have this standard axis. So if I unclick that, then the temperature and time curve would just show everything that happened during the roast, although that doesn't really make sense because, for example, when I'm getting into the cooling mode, then the rate of rise dropped dramatically. So there is a deep spike here, which then really makes it difficult for me to see the relevant things because this is not relevant for me. If I just click on standard axis, then I have a nice view on the roast log. If I get a log from anybody else, I could now extract a profile from a log. So I could take this and then extract a roast profile. In this case, if you yourself did the roast, it doesn't really make sense because then you would have the profile on your Kaffelogic Studio software anyway. But if you get it from somebody else, then you can extract the profile and then either change it or use it on your roaster as well. So yeah, these are the situations that you are going to use your software. So we had the roaster management, we had the profile situation, we have the log situation, and I hope this gave you an understanding on how to work with this software. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you want to know more about the Kaffelogic Nano, then have a look at the other videos on our channel as well. Follow our channel in order not to miss anything, because we're posting regularly videos on different machines, but also on roasting in general. And if you have a particular question on the Kaffelogic Studio software, write it below in the comments or send me an email or a WhatsApp. You find my contact on roasterlevels.com.